Okay, our first panel of the day is the global economy of identity. I'd like to welcome Michael Farrell as your moderator. Michael is the cybersecurity editor of the Christian Science Monitor. He's the editor of Passcode, which is a newly launched section of the paper dedicated to covering the intersection of technology, security, and privacy. Please welcome Michael Farrell.
Hello, everyone. So as Katie said, I'm the editor of Passcode, which is a new venture from the Christian Science Monitor. I know I've been hearing a lot from everybody, well, what's the Christian Science Monitor doing at an identity conference? So if you're still wondering, I will tell you, and it's because of Passcode, which is something that's specifically focused on security and privacy. So we're writing about the things you guys are thinking about and doing stories about those and writing opinion pieces. In fact, yesterday we published a package that we worked on in partnership with the center that you guys can all find on our website, so we'll hope you'll go to that and let us know what you think. So my panelists are much more interesting than I am, so we'll go ahead and get them up on stage, and then we'll, and as they take their seats, one interesting story about coming to a conference that deals with identity is as soon as I got here, I ran into another Michael Farrell. And we sort of were figuring out, well, so how is this that you're here and I'm here too? And it sort of got me thinking about how in the real world, or IRL as the kids say, we can sort of, identity is sort of simple, right? So that Michael Farrell, he'll stand up. So you can tell, we can all tell that we're a little bit different. He's better looking than I am, although I have more hair for now. But that won't last much longer. But when we think about this panel in particular, we're talking about our challenge today is to talk about the global identity economy, which is a vast topic that I'm sure all the panelists will be able to crack, and we'll all leave here better understanding that. But when I sort of thought about the interaction with the other Michael Farrell, there are other ways that we have in this country to figure out, well, which is the one that's supposed to be talking and which is the one that's from the Christian Science Monitor. We can pull out our license, we can look at our job titles. But in the developing world, there aren't those sorts of things that exist, and that's something that which we'll talk about, these new solutions, these new approaches to developing an identity economy in places like India and Africa, where you still have to often take people on their word, and there are probably many people with the same names who will show up to vote or to register for health services and that sort of thing. So we'll look at some of those issues. I know I've talked to the panelists as well. We want to think about some solutions to the problem that we're all here to talk about. Yesterday, I think many of us may have left thinking that we're all doomed, right? There's nothing we can do to protect ourselves. Frank Abagnale is basically busy hacking all of our identities at the moment. Kidding, but he did say he could do it in 15 seconds flat. So it's sort of frightening, but I think there are some real solutions and better ways to think about this. So without further ado, we'll have the panelists sort of introduce themselves, and then we'll get to what I hope to be a lively discussion and with lots of participation from the audience. So Edward, we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Ed Goodman. I'm Chief Privacy Officer for ID360. I like to joke I'm a recovering attorney. My background is in privacy. I have a master's from a Dutch university after law school, studying comparative privacy law between the European Union and North America, and deal with a lot of data breach, identity theft issues, mostly for the insurance industry and financial services.
Hi, good morning. My name is Brian Engel. I'm the Executive Director of the Retail Cyber Intelligence Sharing Center, a newly formed organization that supports retail and other consumer-facing, commercial services-oriented organizations to share information around cybersecurity, protections, as well as hopefully rapid response. I guess interestingly enough, I'm known as former Texas DIR on the screen up there, and I like the fact that we each have name placards with our names on the other side, so we can clearly identify ourselves.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Susan Walton. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Equifax, and I've been in the role about a year and a half, so it's a really interesting change for me and certainly a different security challenge than my past role where I was Chief Security Officer for First Data, a payments processing company, for 4 years. My long career has been primarily in various roles of IT, so I'm more of an IT security type person with governance and compliance mixed, and I currently have, of course, responsibility for cybersecurity, network security, and all those good things, but the physical security as well. So it's real interesting to see how those two worlds actually merge together when you're addressing threats and trying to understand the threats against the company.
Ben?
Good morning. My name is Ben Bass. I work for the Secret Service. James Bass is my undercover identity. You'll see up there. I've worked for the Secret Service for over 16 years. I started in a Dallas field office. I worked financial crimes and cybercrime back then. Transferred up to the President's detail for approximately 5 years, and then over to our headquarters where I managed our electronic crimes section there, and then recently made my way back to Texas as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of our San Antonio field office.
I'm John Danaher. I work for TransUnion. I manage TransUnion's direct-to-consumer business. We make credit monitoring and identity protection products available to consumers here in the U.S., and I'm also responsible for those products globally, so in markets like India, South Africa, Hong Kong, and Canada. I've been with TransUnion for 13 years, and I've been in this role for 10, so it's been interesting to see the evolution of the issues that we've been talking about from a consumer's perspective.
Well, as you can see, we have a diverse panel, and I think everyone will have a different idea of what some of the challenges are when thinking about the identity economy in a global way. So, what I'm interested in hearing first are what are some of the biggest challenges when you're talking about identity across borders and protecting it and basically authentication. So maybe we'll start with you, Susan. You told me earlier today that Equifax works in 18 countries, so maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenges of being a global identity company.
Yeah, so it certainly does have its challenges, and we're obviously a U.S.-based company, so we base our program first and foremost on meeting the controls that are set forth by the U.S. regulatory bodies and our big clients that are also based in the U.S. So that really is our baseline of controls. And then when it comes to meeting the challenges of doing business in other countries, we often find that we have to do special things or additional things. We really never relax the controls, but we get more prescriptive and more, more controls of different types. So if you look at Europe, for example, say take the UK, with the Financial Conduct Authority and the EU data privacy laws, that causes us to do special things to protect UK data. And when it comes to Europe especially, and many of the countries in Eastern Europe are very strict around, take Poland for example. If the data is developed in Poland, by gosh, they want it to stay in Poland and only be touched and managed by people that are inside Poland, preferably Polish citizens. And if you violate that, then the fines and things against a company can be pretty strict. I mean, even up to and including jail time in some countries. We find the same thing in Asia and somewhat in Latin America as well, although Latin America tends to be a little bit squishy. Culturally they're much more acceptable of kind of blurring the lines, but we do, again, try to operate under US-based controls. So you were talking a few minutes ago about FCRA violations, and of course as a US-based company that is first and foremost for us are FCPA violations. Even though in a squishy kind of culture like Latin America, we still do keep ourselves to those controls.
Is Europe driving the global conversation around privacy? I mean, are they sort of setting what, the standard that a lot of U.S. companies have to abide by now?
I don't know that I would say that necessarily. Ben might be a better expert in that topic, but I think we certainly are aware of it, and it certainly does cause us to have to do a lot more things just to protect that European data.
What do you think, Edward?
Yeah, I think that used to be the case. I think they're trying to strive for that again. I mean, the problem with Europe is they had some very thought-leading EU directives and regulations that went into place in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they've had sort of a set-it-and-forget-it attitude ever since. And unfortunately, going to the core of the question, I think that's a bit of the problem. I mean, we have, one of the biggest, things that is a difficulty to overcome from international identity and transfer are the regulatory schemes. And the regulatory schemes are in place because every regulatory scheme is reflective of those social norms in that area. So I think, you have to look at it from that perspective, and every set of social norms you have to look at from a cultural lens. So in Europe in particular, Germany, they're the prime example. They're probably one of the most, privacy-crazy countries around. Well, why? Well, look back 70 years, see what happened, and see how the regime back then utilized private data, commingled it with government data. So, there's a lot of those issues. And so, we're a small company, but we're going global. We've been in Canada for 2 years. We just opened in the UK, and we're compliant, but, we're safe harbor certified. We're very conscious of this stuff. However, we've had to set up our operations so the data does not move across border. Why? Well, because it's a PR thing. It's not necessarily that we can't legally do it. We can. We've got the safeguards in place, but we realize when working with Canadian consumers whether it's accurate or not. Maybe post-Snowden it's a little more accurate than I had originally thought. But there's a perception that their data may not be safe in the U.S. Same thing with Europeans. Now, again, perception is key when you're working with consumers. So, I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers really is that perception or that misperception to some degrees. I mean, we talked about this, I think, last night, is that we know how bad things are from identity fraud and data breach perspective in the U.S. because we have regulations that now have forced transparency in that area. Data breach notification laws for a decade. They don't have that in Europe. So, I think that's, it's these cultural issues that are really difficult, probably the most difficult to overcome. And I think that the regulatory, again, I'm a comparative lawyer, so I always look at it. There's always ways to work with the regulations and get them to work and do it in a way that makes you completely compliant. The problem is, even doing that, you're going to have these other burdens of how the public looks at you, looks at those data transfers, and I think that's probably one of the biggest things that stymies a lot of this international data transfer, from organizations that are global.
How about the other side? Brian, if you had something to say, I don't want to neglect the other side of the table here, our right flank, or my right flank. But you guys want to jump in on that? I mean, Ben, you have a very different perspective probably when thinking about international challenges, less about regulation, more about the ability to enforce laws.
Sure. I think, the difficulties, one is harmonizing laws. So a little bit, that harmonizing of the enforcement laws would be a huge benefit to law enforcement. The standards, the practices, how do we handle digital evidence? That's a very difficult thing when you're crossing international borders and working with other governments. Another thing is building international law enforcement capabilities. In several other countries, they do not have a robust cybercrime unit to work identity fraud and identity crimes and data breaches. They just don't. We have been working with OAS and ILEA through the State Department. That ILEA is the Law Enforcement Training Academy. We work with them to teach cybercrime, but still the laws sometimes are different. So there's a lot of work that could be done there.
John, you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I think about it from the perspective of, there is, I think, a heightened awareness now in the U.S., about the value of your personal information and that it's not a good idea to share it with folks. I mean, I think we've gotten to that point here over the last few years. But in the international markets that that I'm responsible for, there's a very, I mean, the issue of, the value of your PII and your willingness to share it, there's very low awareness. So, I was recently in South Africa, and one of the challenges that, our business faces is, of course, verifying that the person coming to us to access the credit data is the person who they say they are. And what we find there is people, there are entrepreneurs who have, a cell phone or a smartphone, and will go around and ask people, would you like to see your credit report? And people are willing to give them some cash and surrender their PII. And, this person then will come to us. We have their device and their cell phone number, but now associated with another, person's PII. So, those are some of the challenges that we're facing, outside the U.S. In terms of, and it does remind me of, where we were 10 or 15 years ago. It's getting that awareness out there that, this is something that is valuable and you need to protect, and that you shouldn't be sharing it with other people.
So as places like Africa, South Africa, India kind of march toward this identity economy in a more fulsome way, is there an educational component that you're working on to try to teach these new consumers to try to, not give up their PII so quickly and easily and be so trusting?
Yes, I mean, it's a big part of what we do is, when that person then comes back to us on their own and tells us the story of how they, gave their credentials to somebody else the first time to access their data, we're educating that specific individual. Through our advertising, we're trying to make people aware that, again, this is something that you need to protect and control. But it just varies by market too. Like in India, I think this was mentioned earlier, many people just have one name and there is no unique identifier in India. So what we're doing there is working with the government to implement a unique identifier for people. So it's really kind of starting from the ground up, and then, as you say, educating folks on, all right, here's your unique identifier, don't share this with anybody so that they can pretend that they are you.
And Brian, you want to jump in here? You focus mostly on the retail space, but maybe you could sort of talk about this global challenge from that perspective.
I guess one thing I just wanted to say is in kind of terms of the regulation aspect, which I would kind of equate to kind of driving by looking in your rearview mirror. It's not necessarily the thing that's going to get you to the objectives that you have, and that's why I think that most organizations sort of do what they have to do in those areas, and it doesn't necessarily propel the level of change. And the other aspect of it is that within this kind of this economy of identity, not all the players are going to adhere to the rules. In fact, many of them aren't even going to acknowledge the rules. So, those regulations are applying to organizations. They're sort of setting standards. And it's all necessary. I don't want to kind of make it sound like, well, that's not going to work. But it's a lever amongst many other levers that we would need to consider. So, just kind of as we've talked about how some of the normalization of some of the rules, regulations, or how they would apply, I think that they're all necessary, but, we can't kind of hang our hat on those as a solution. And I'd also say that I don't know that we're trying to solve something as much as we are trying to just navigate and manage within it. It is an economy. It's a functional sort of thing, even if the aspects of it are things that are sort of outside the edges of what we want from transactions and other types of things to occur. So, not to, sort of come from the global retailer aspect of things here that, fundamentally they wake up every day trying to provide something to somebody that hopefully that somebody wants. Mm-hmm. And, so the types of things that reduce those costs, reduce fraud, I think are all in the mind because those are costs that are deteriorating from the ultimate goal of profit in that space. But it's, again, not the primary driving force. So
So, even though we live in a digital world in which fraud is a reality, are there, interesting solutions that are bubbling up abroad that, could sort of start to change the dynamic? I know, Susan, you mentioned a sort of interesting idea that Alibaba has of developing a different kind of authentication. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
About that, read an article just on Monday afternoon about Alibaba, and you probably all know what that is, right? It's the online empire that Jack Ma has built in China, multi-billion-dollar company now. So they've created a service called Zima, Z-H-I-M-A, and they call it a personal credit scoring system. And they're using different data elements, not a financial score, but they're building it based on court reports, rental car returns, educational history, volunteer work, community service, and they're putting all that together to create a personal credit score for a person so that they can make a decision whether to, give a rental car without a deposit required, or give a certain kind of loan, or maybe a low credit limit credit card. So I just thought it was interesting that they're beginning to think differently about the identity and all the elements that you can put together to make a decision on behalf of someone and drive the economy forward. So you kind of play that out in the Frank Abagnale scenario. How many years will it be before the bad guys see that we're monetizing those data elements and then taking advantage of that to, in the long view, then commit fraud with those data elements as well. But I still think it's a positive that Alibaba is kind of blazing the trail, and maybe it'll be a game changer for us to think about elements of identity differently in different ways that we can use them.
Anybody else seeing anything that they're sort of impressed by in terms of
Just to
new
chime in on
ideas?
that,
Sure.
though, it's one of those kind of things. So Frank Abagnale talked about like the 41 element, or the adding the additional elements. If it's just more things that are freely available or obtainable on the internet to learn about somebody, their community service, any of those types of things, then it's still gameable. So it's creating more secrets to protect, perhaps, and I think we're already kind of proving that we've got too many secrets to try to keep as it is, and we're trying to keep those secrets, perhaps, as the custodian of some of this information, but the person that's out there with that information sort of freely giving it away in almost every aspect of their lives. So I think it's just an interesting perspective to consider how that plays out.
Right. So is the idea then that we need to scrub the web of as much PII as possible, or is that even
Pandora's box, right? I mean,
Right.
you can't get it back.
Well, the thing is, these are emerging economies with emerging middle classes, and here in the U.S., again, it's cultural lens. We're a credit society. We never would have moved west in this country without credit. It's the way this country has been built, has been founded on personal credit, on corporate credit, and I think that emerging economies like India, like China, they recognize that. If you want, upward mobility, you need to be able to take risks on individuals to be able to lend them, capital, whether it's personal or business capital, and you need some mechanism to be able to, whatever that data set is, to refer and talk about amongst, other credit grantors what that risk level is. Once upon a time, the Old West was your reputation, and it wasn't quite as good as a credit score, but it did pretty well back then. I think, a lot of this is what we're seeing is in economies that don't have the regulation. There's no Fair Credit Reporting Act in China, and so, I think it does, just like in this country, it does have to evolve somewhat organically like that, Okay, they don't have a government-issued ID that they can leverage like an SSN, which was never really meant to be used that way. So, I don't know if there's much choice in that, and I think you're going to be seeing these data sets, and I agree, it's gameable, to some degree, but, I think it's different in using them as primary identifiers to authenticate versus a data set to be able to create a profile on what your risk is, from that standpoint. So, again, I'm no judgment, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I do think it's, very interesting because, again, these are new emerging economies that cannot be ignored, and that growing middle class that we as Americans and American companies are trying to sell to, we need that as well developed, from our perspective to be able to expand services into those countries. So, I think it's a good observation, and not without a lot of pitfalls, of course.
So, John, did you have anything? I know you're active in the developing world. Do you want to chime in there before we move on?
Yeah, we, here in the U.S., we have a line of people alternative, quote-unquote, alternative lenders who are using different data elements to decision for financial services products. I mean, one that I've heard of is, they'll give you a $300 credit card based on your SAT score or your ACT score. And then, what all those alternative lenders want to do then is report that item to the credit bureau and get that on there, on the file. But I think to Susan's point, these other attributes that people are using now for decisioning lie outside the traditional credit reporting system, and I think are much more vulnerable to be, compromised. They're out there. So, that's something that we're going to have to, from an identity verification perspective, continue to look at. What data elements are out there? What data elements can we use to verify that somebody is who they say they are, and make sure that the data that we're taking in and putting on credit files isn't something that's been compromised in the past.
All right, Ben, I think you guys have been pretty creative lately about trying to go out and sort of navigate some of these international norms when it comes to arresting the bad guys, the fraudsters and such. Maybe you could talk about a couple of the high-profile cases over the past year and some of the ways you've been able to sort of navigate the international waters to bring some of these high-profile scammers back to the U.S. to face trial.
Sure, I'll cover what I can. I don't want to overlook the importance of our partnerships, our state and local partnerships that we've built here, and then overseas. We have 24 offices overseas. We have 2 electronic crimes task forces overseas. And it's really our partnerships that have been the foundation for our arrests overseas. That and working very closely with DOJ, CSIPs to locate the individuals and actually confirm attribution to those individuals, and then ultimately develop probable cause and go through the steps necessary to arrest and extradite them. Example would be Vladimir Horn. We know him as Bad B. That was his handle that he used. He boasted that he ran the largest dump vendor site as payment card data. That I actually saw the site. The site operated very similar to an Amazon or an eBay site where you could pick the kind of card and the value and the level and order those cards. He openly bragged about that. We had, through various sources and other arrests, been able to confirm attribution to him. And when he did travel, and we found out about it through our alliances at Interpol, we were able to locate him in Nice, France. He had traveled from Russia to Nice, and we were able to ultimately arrest him. It took about 18 months to extradite him back to the U.S., but that was a very successful operation. It takes time, it takes patience, but these type of cases have a huge impact and send more than just the message. It also lets people know that working with our partners, we're gonna find you, and we're gonna locate, and we're gonna bring you back to the U.S. for prosecution if we can. If they ultimately get prosecuted in France or say another country, we want to see those prosecutions happen.
So, in addition to just going down and, figuring out ways to extradite these guys back to the U.S., what are some ways that you think you can start to reduce this crime from happening in places like the Ukraine or other places in Eastern Europe?
I really think we need to enhance the capacity for international law enforcement in the training side. I think that to do that, we need to do more training and put more emphasis on enforcement overseas and work closely with our partners in that area, because it's the partnerships that truly enable these arrests to happen overseas. Over there, I like to say, they're cops just like us. They want to see a bad guy go to jail, and sometimes the politics get in the way, but ultimately they want to do the right thing. I think that's where our protection mission really integrates well with our investigative mission, because we do travel and we do these advances and we work with these other cops overseas, and we develop those close relationships. They blossom into investigative relationships also.
Great. Yeah, one of the things that's a big debate in Washington that we've been following, passcode, is the information sharing bills that are moving through Congress. I'm interested to know how your industry works together to try to spot, new methods of fraud and exchanging information, and perhaps working with law enforcement to sort of, if you're able to detect some anomalies with things going on in, and help the industry as a whole. I mean, maybe you could talk about that as, you're at the nexus of this information sharing idea and practice.
Yeah, I think it's just really important to consider progressing information sharing and kind of broadening some terms and understanding how those things can help. So first couple of things are sort of the traditional intelligence sharing concept was taking like a specific artifact and kind of making sure that everyone could be aware of it, find it, and do something actionable with it, right? I'm kind of throwing the buzzword bingo of intelligence sharing out there, and realizing that by and large, and talking to Ben about this yesterday too, like a lot of organizations are at a place where they need to be working on much more essential pieces to be able to protect themselves. So intelligence is sort of this very reactive game today, and we've got to bring it to a place where it's much more strategic, and that intelligence sharing is happening more on the front end, and limiting the amount of breaches that are occurring, and maybe take some of this law enforcement and get it to the place where they don't have as much to do, because they're not sort of chasing the already happened breach, but improving capabilities to the place where we're minimizing the breaches that are occurring. Yeah, it's very Pollyanna, but I mean that's the level of kind of conversation that we're having in the retail space, is to try to get the information sharing to the stage where strategically they're able to prevent, protect, and detect a lot better. And then the reactive response after something occurs, trying to have that happen at a very rapid rate, so that the number of organizations perhaps that are affected are minimized. I think and we've heard this, and I think the key back to identity is that within this ecosystem and within this economy, no one is an island. The retailer that's doing business with someone isn't doing business with just that consumer. That consumer is doing business with all of them. They're using lots of bad practices that we perhaps can try to change, but they're using the same kind of credentials and the same types of things. They're linking back to the same kind of credit card usage. It just behooves each of those organizations and retailers to really cooperate and work together, because I think the concept of being faster than the bear kind of creates this, well, if I can shove you down, I can be faster than you, and that still isn't helpful, because again, the credentials that consumer is using to obtain services, to buy goods through my online presence is the same credential set that's probably being used elsewhere. And when those are out there in the wild, then everybody is potentially being affected. And that's a much harder level of fraud to detect, because it looks like a legitimate identity. They're actually logging in with credentials that we are now trusting. And now we're looking for things like behaviors, and the behaviors of shopping and spending and other types of things. So I think that the next place from this information sharing is, how do we get some of those fraudulent behaviors and some of those indexes or variables that are happening in the financial services realm, the things that are sort of bringing people to the brink of what shuts down that credit card, and moving that to the place where the retailer actually has some degree of knowledge of that. They can look at a certain transaction, see that it's a high volume electronic purchase or something of that nature, and make a decision. That's a tough place to be. You obviously don't want to place, the person that's manning the register at the store in the place of rejecting that transaction based upon, a terminal saying, this is kind of sketchy. Perhaps it can be much better in the card not present area, where, you just step people through higher levels of friction. So those are the types of things that I think we need to consider. But as we're all kind of linked in this, it's kind of easy to play Monday morning quarterback after yesterday and kind of bring out some of those components of what was brought up, but I think that those are some of the things that we need to consider overall.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on the information sharing aspect of that?
Yeah, so the one thing that I'll say is that after being in financial services for more than a decade, we found that the ISACs are extremely helpful. And someone mentioned it yesterday, it might have been Frank, but FSISAC is one that I've participated in for a very long time. That stands for Financial Services Information Sharing and Advisory Council. And it's a consortium where financial services companies participate of all kinds, banks, insurance, brokers, credit bureaus, and so forth, together with government partners, so DHS and others. And there's a very active cyber threat center where we do information sharing of various compromised signatures. We get that on a proactive basis so that we know well ahead of time when there's a campaign coming, and we can do some proactive blocking for that. So if anybody has the opportunity to participate in your ISAC, whether it's financial services ISAC or manufacturing, there's even a real estate ISAC now, I think, so there's sort of all shapes and sizes of that. But
Including retail and commercial services.
including retail, yeah. So very, very helpful for that. And, we find that together with various intel sources that we subscribe to helps us have an intel-driven program and not a sort of tools-driven signature-based alerting type of program. And intel is so vital because when you understand who your threat actor is, you can start to understand their motivation and what they're after, which helps you then better protect the data that you have.
Can you be a little bit more specific and talk about something like that you actually helped that stopped at Equifax or because one of the things that the ISACs have been talked about, right, is it's a theory, right? More information leads to preventing crime or there are bad things from happening. Well, and then there's, especially in the cybersecurity space, there's this sense that, well, once you get it from the ISAC, or it's too late, right? What's been your experience? Like, if you can be specific.
Well, gosh,
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Multiple things per week happen. It's almost a daily thing where we will get information from the CERT, the U.S. CERT, that is sponsored partly by the FSISAC and by the government entities. So, just as an example, so we might get threat indicators about a Dridex malware campaign. Dridex is oriented towards stealing credentials for banking or financial information to be used to log on for account takeovers. So if we get those signatures in time, we can, of course, update our firewalls and our proxies and put in place things like DNS sync holding so that if we see that traffic, it just gets sync hold away and it may get in, but it will never get out. And those are very common things where we're able to utilize that information.
Great. Anything from this side?
Yeah, I may be out of my area of expertise here, but we compete with Equifax and Experian, on all sorts of things. But one area that I think we do cooperate on is on security and cybersecurity. So I think there is sharing of information in terms of what we're seeing on our networks, with Equifax and Experian, because we assume that if, they're coming to us, that they probably have the other two companies in mind as well. So, again, I think, that's important that we share information there, share information about potential threats. The one area where I think we could do more is partnership with government. That's, government obviously has a lot of data, IRS data, the Social Security Administration, et cetera, and that, partnering with those folks, I think, is a little more difficult. We're working towards that, but I think greater sharing between government and industry, would be a key to, trying to bring these crimes down.
All right, Ben, as the representative from the federal government, you're up. How are you going to make that happen?
Well, the sharing piece is tough. I mean, there's no doubt. I don't want to sugarcoat it and say it's not been tough, and I'm sure the private sector companies, I can see their frustrations. I can see it. They want the data, they want the information, and they want it as quickly as possible. One of the toughest things in law enforcement is we're bound by certain secrecy obligations for courts, for court purposes. We also want to be very careful when we're providing the data that we're not providing data on an innocent victim that we think possibly could be a suspect, but turns out they're not. And so we want to protect the victims if they truly are until we're 100% sure. Another hurdle I see in information sharing is we constantly talk about stripping off the data, stripping off identifiers, and that also takes manpower and time. And when you're an operational unit such as the Secret Service and you have manpower constraints, it often is difficult to just take large data sets and strip off identifiers in some instances. But we work very closely with the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center. All agencies, I guess, well, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors. They're all represented there. And they've been great about pushing out and being the voice for that DHS information sharing piece. And so we have representatives assigned there full time. We quickly try to get the information to them, let them help sanitize it and push out the alerts. And if you haven't visited the NCIC website, I encourage you to do so. They have excellent resources there that can help push the data. And then we use our electronic crimes task forces to push out the data to our registered partners being, Mr. Novi covered it earlier. These are actual individuals that we have personally developed a relationship with. We know who they are. It's not an email address. These are individuals, and we do push those alerts out to them.
Yeah, one of the things that I think Mr. Novi brought up were the data breach laws, and one of the ways investigators often need time, right, to develop these cases.
Sure.
Obama has proposed a federal data breach law. I mean, as an investigator, do you feel like if everyone knows about a breach too soon, does it start to compromise the ability for law enforcement?
It can. It absolutely can. I mean, in law enforcement, obviously, if to bring it back to a traditional law enforcement role, if everybody knows that the criminal lives in this house, the criminal is going to quickly move before law enforcement has a chance to come in and set up on that house using that traditional role. The data breach law, though, does protect, American taxpayers, and that's who we serve. And so I understand their side too, because this is their PII that's out there. This is their information that's out in the open, and certainly, if my information's out there, I want to be notified that my information's been released. And so I see the conflict there.
Right. One thing that I think Susan, you brought up were regulations and privacy regulations in particular, and those are, there's a raging privacy debate happening in Washington. Congress is considering the Patriot Act and the USA Freedom Act and the way the government collects data. And as Snowden revealed, the NSA has the ability to tap into some of these data repositories that private companies have. So how has that been, as a company that operates internationally, dealing with the issue of privacy of the data that you hold and ensuring other countries and that you're able to keep that data secret?
Yeah. So the privacy laws certainly, I think about those similar to the way I think about the regulatory environment. It's very similar, a privacy regulation, in fact. So, again, we try to pretty much just make sure that we can meet what the U.S. wants, and then if there's something additional or specific for a country in terms of their privacy laws, we'll do that in addition. But I think what Ben just brought up about the notification piece of it is really key here. So if there is a breach of privacy, if you will, then we have to very quickly determine whether we have to notify or not. And that means really deep understanding of what the privacy laws are for that country, and and what steps you have to take and how quickly. And somewhat it depends based on interpretation of those laws and working with local law enforcement of the country. And so, you sometimes get into a conundrum about that.
Has it, to Edward's point, has it been a perception problem when you're working abroad?
In what way?
In the way that how the data is stored, who has access to it. You know, you're an American company. That means the American government's going to be tracking, collecting, gathering the data you hold.
I can't say that we've seen that. I haven't noticed it yet so far, at least at this company. But, you know, I think it could certainly occur because if it is discovered that you are violating those laws, you know, at a country level, then I think all of those countries are looking for revenue and they'll levy big fines. We've seen many fines across Europe for that. So it seems sort of opportunistic, but they are looking for ways to make their point and sort of the public hanging. So we certainly don't want to be the one that's in the public hanging, but we do see those things happening, and so it serves to make us that much more vigilant about what's happening with privacy in the country.
What about you, Ed? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I mean, we've experienced that, you know, but I would like to argue to some degree that, you know, I think a lot of jurisdictions, especially in Europe, also use it as an anti-American company kind of competitive advantage argument. You know, because let's face it, every jurisdiction, whether it's Germany, the UK, you know, Brazil, any of these that have criticized them, they've also all reaped the benefit of you know, this intel sharing, you know, from our and their intelligence organizations do the exact same thing. So, you know, I think that there is a public perception. I know that as a small company and having, you know, small operations in you know, again, Canada and the UK and Ireland, you know, we've had to, because of that perception, make sure that, you know, again, okay, now we have an operation there, that's where our servers are, you know, or you know, not to endorse Microsoft or any other product, but we use Office 365 because it's been blessed by the Article 29 working group in Europe saying, hey, we know that this is cloud-based, but that the data stays in Europe. So, you know, all these little considerations that go into play, and it's not that we can't take the data, we're set up to be able to do it, and you know, we have that capability as well for a backup perspective, just in case something, you know, from a failover standpoint, disaster recovery and all of that. But, you know, we've talked to many clients, insurance carriers and groups like that, and that's their perception. And so our answer has had to be, no, the data's all here. It's all an insular operation. It doesn't get transferred. You know, so there's that perception, but I do think a lot of it from especially the European regulators, tends to be a lot more much ado about nothing, and sort of the same anti-competitive, like, you know, grenade over the wall that we saw against Microsoft and you know, back in 2000. It's the same thing we're seeing lodged against companies like Google, you know, now, and the argument now is not anti-competition or monopolistic practices necessarily. To some degree it might be, but privacy issues, you know. So, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt, I guess, is my you know, my main thing, and that, you know, it's there. Is it real or not? I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends if you're more of the tinfoil hat conspiracist, you know, theory person or not. But
Did you want to say something else, or Brian? Do you want to weigh in? Anybody over here on that? What are you seeing abroad, John, as a result of sort of the NSA
Yeah,
debate?
just from a regulatory perspective, it's interesting, you know, of course, you know, we here in the U.S., we deal primarily with the CFPB, and they focus mostly on our marketing practices, what we're telling consumers and how we're advertising and positioning our products, and there's really very little regulation around privacy or identity verification. The countries that we work in, Canada and Hong Kong in particular, have very robust and active, you know, privacy regulation in terms of the government, and they basically, in our advertising, we can almost say whatever we want, which is nice, but they're very keen to review our procedures on, you know, who we're letting view personal data and how robust our identity verification systems are, to the point of, you know, we're providing them with you know, the detailed implementations of, you know, how we do it, and they're reviewing that from a safety and soundness perspective. On the portability of data issue, you know, Canada, we can take the data back here to the U.S., but Hong Kong, it can't leave, so it's got to be resident in Hong Kong. So we have to adapt our business practices to the local local jurisdictions, but it is interesting, like each country's focus on particular issues that are important to them.
Where are the toughest regulations that you found? Where are the toughest regulations from your experience?
Yeah, I would say the toughest that we deal with are in Hong Kong. Both, from the data portability, it would be nice if we could run some of this, from the U.S. or from another location, but we're not able to. And they have been the most active in terms of reviewing, our identity verification system, and in, really almost kind of dictating what can be done and what can't be done as far as that goes. So, we're always interested in getting the most people through while still protecting it against fraud. They're obviously, want a much stricter identity verification system because they don't want really any possibility of somebody viewing somebody else's data.
Is there a correlation there between the privacy regulations and reduction of fraud? I mean, do you see, are those two separate things, or, is Hong Kong is a model that, I mean, they're probably annoying to you, but is it something that is better for the consumer?
Yeah, I'm not, I think it is kind of there is a cultural thing there about, protecting one's own data. We also, in that market, for example, it's very mobile enabled, a lot of internet access, et cetera, but we still get a very sizable chunk of consumers who are not willing to put their PII on the web at all, and they come to the office. So we have to keep like a window open where people could come in and present their credentials and receive their credit information. So I think, some of these cultural things kind of reinforce, the actions that the regulators take in terms of, the degree of protection that they want there.
Ben, did you have anything to add to this discussion? Because I mean, it's sort of interesting when we talked about the NSA revelations. We've talked about, and of course, much of the conversation that's been had here yesterday talked about the incidences of fraud. So I wonder, as combined, so you've got revelations of government snooping online. You've got this incredible fraud that's happening. Is there some kind of cultural shift happening in the U.S., or consumers starting to withdraw their PII from digital databases and archives? Are they trying to scrub it more? Are you seeing any evidence of that sort of change consumer behavior, or are we still just giving it all away? Anybody? Nothing?
I don't have empirical data, but like this concept of Generation Z that doesn't seem to withhold anything. And, it's kind of ironic that we would kind of brand it with the last letter of the alphabet, because it's like, what is that? Game over at that point?
Yeah, but speak up a little bit, Brian.
I'm sorry. It's not anything based upon empirical evidence, but you hear a lot of the commentary around Generation Z being, that they just won't withhold anything. Everything that they value are ways to share things even more about themselves, whether it's Pinterest or whatever it might be. And then the irony of perhaps naming it Generation Z with the last letter of the alphabet means what? I mean,
yeah, what comes next?
Yeah, exactly. You can't go beyond that. I mean, yeah, exactly.
I think we're starting to see, that younger generation learn the hard lessons that Generation Z is learning now, as a result of that. So, there hasn't been any generation that's lived in this environment yet, where you can carry around a device in your pocket that's an audio recorder, a video recorder, has GPS, has internet connectivity, does all these fantastic things, and oh yeah, it's a phone too. And you get this mobility and capability starting usually at age 12. That didn't exist when I was a teenager. I'm a Gen Xer, so however you want to label stuff. But and I think that next generation, post Generation Z, I think they see the negative repercussions. We were talking about this last night too. It's one thing to say, oh, this is all great. It's another thing in 10 years to wake up and now you're applying for a job at 35 and you've got some compromising pictures you posted on Facebook when you were in college that are coming back to haunt you 15 years later. Again, we didn't have that. There was that idea of this will go on your permanent record didn't exist. It was a big fallacy. Now you do have a permanent record. So, I think that, I haven't seen any pullback on sharing, to your point at all. I think, again, to some degree, we're also in that cat's out of the bag situation here. And I think other jurisdictions have there's good and bad to it. It's very easy to again, there's a convenience level to that data sharing where it's a lot easier to get credit here than it is if I wanted to buy a house in Europe or if I wanted to finance a car. And there's no judgment there. It's good and bad, but, I think that, I haven't seen much of a pullback, but I think we're still in the early stages of seeing what those negative repercussions are. I mean, we've had data breach laws for maybe a decade now, notification regs, and, so it's still very nascent, but, I do think that following generations are gonna learn from those hard lessons of, oh, well, did you hear that story about that kid who didn't get into college because the admissions counselor at that university saw them, getting crazy at a high school party or doing something silly like that? Those stories, they're already starting to be out there. There's plenty of examples of it, and I think again, unfortunately, there'll be a lot more hard lessons learned before, hopefully my kids, recognize, I don't want to overshare. I got to be very controlling and almost create a public persona, in that process.
Right. I mean, it's almost like this. We're adding new things to the digital dossier about our lives that could be used as PII, right? So now that drunken party is a unique identifier. And anybody else want to sort of jump in there and talk about that?
I want to add, so we're a fan of the Javelin work as well, and there's a research report that just came out in March 2015 about direct-to-consumer fraud. And the point that they were making is that I think they said of U.S. consumers, they spent about $1.4 billion on identity theft protection in 2014, and half of those that subscribed to that had never had it before. So I thought that showed more of an interest in people wanting to take care of their identity information. But then they went on to say that out of that population that people seem to be very interested in identity theft resolution services. So that says to me that people are, sort of thinking, it's going to happen, there's not much I can do about it, but I'd be interested in a service that helped me fix my income tax fraud problem, or that helped me fix my medical ID theft fraud problem, or, or helped me remove my data from social media. So it was suggesting that out of talking to that population, they'd be interested in services to help with that. So it says to me that people know we're in this environment, it's probably not gonna stop, but they're interested in getting some help.
Right. I think that similar report also talked about the people who, so there's the free subscription versus the paid, which and the people also walking away from those services
Right.
because they either don't find the value of them because maybe nothing's bad has happened. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting sort of new marketplace, I guess, that someone yesterday sort of talked about as being kind of the flavor of the month, but perhaps not being a cause, but it could be one potential solution. I mean, I think we're at this point in life, right? And as someone said this, who writes for Passcode, a woman named Nicole Wong, who is the former chief deputy technology officer of the White House, said there's no point in the future where there will be less data about us on the world. So, with that in mind, how do we begin to protect ourselves from fraud? I mean, maybe, Ben, do you have any sort of any tips? I mean, what do we do as consumers to be protected?
I wish there was a magic bullet because we would all share it and protect ourselves. But I do not want to underestimate the importance of education. We were talking a little bit earlier about data out there, social media. I give you an example. Obviously the growth in social media. You look back into the early 2000s. There's probably a handful of social media sites. And then as it's grown, now you've got hundreds of social media sites. I was dealing with a company that was experiencing a lot of phishing attacks that involved wire transfers requests. And when we started looking about how that could possibly be happening, what we found was that they had put so much information about their entire corporate structure on social media, including where their CEO had attended college, in-depth details that it made him an easy target for phishing. So, it's a double-edged sword. You put your information out there about your company grows, but you also become a target for phishing. Phishing is something, though, that can be, if you use education on the front end and turn your employees into actually sensors to pick up on phishing, I really think you can make a huge difference in the corporate setting.
Yeah. So I want to give the panelists the opportunity to ask questions among themselves or also bring up topics that we haven't addressed yet. Anybody burning to talk about something that we haven't? You want to challenge these guys across? I mean, maybe a duel.
I just throw out this thing that we mentioned this morning even. We talk about a global economy and it's just sort of triangulating the value of identity. There's, like my information and how I value it, how I've given it to somebody else and how they value it in protecting it, and then how somebody out there is trying to use it in harm or fraud and how they're valuing it. And as a custodian and as information security professional and risk management professional for most of my career, I think we always looked at other factors to define how to value it, regulations and other types of things which don't create the value that we would protect it at. And that we really need to shift the focus to how the fraudster is valuing it, but not necessarily just from the custodian's perspective, but from that end user, that person that has trusted by putting it out there, needs to understand how that criminal is valuing that data, because I think that's the only thing that starts to shift the balance to a place where custodian protects it at a higher level, person protects it at a higher level, and makes it harder and raises the cost on the criminal level. So.
I mean, we were also chatting earlier today, and I asked you, is there a way to create a digital identity that's bulletproof, that's not fakeable? You can't. It's impossible.
Ultimately, it's the conundrum of the multiple Michaels, right?
Right.
That there's always going to be multiple Michaels in a digital sense, and based upon what we place upon that to establish who the Michael is. I think from a digital perspective, I don't see a way.
It's always been like that. The first people who protected their goods put a rock over the hole they put it in, and someone used a lever and moved it, and so they put a bigger rock, and then it's been cat and mouse ever since. And identity is the same way. And really, to your point, I think global economy, whether it's identity or whatever, it includes a dark economy as well. I mean, there's a drug economy out there, illicit trafficking of drugs, human trafficking. Identity is no different. I would argue there's more of a positive on both sides of when you're talking about identity than you are drugs and human trafficking. But my point is that it's one of those interesting areas where it's an intangible, it's non-fungible. My identity doesn't change. Good luck getting a new SSN. I could do a name change, maybe change my address, but those are secondary identifiers to verify who I am anyways. So it really doesn't matter. So I don't think there's any golden ticket, but I think it is to be looked at from a grander scale and realize there is legitimate value in identity and identifying and being able to make sure that that you are you and recognized by others that way from that standpoint, but recognizing that there's equal value in the illicit trafficking of that, and and again, so that the economy, black and the white, the good and the bad as far as that. And I think that's just one takeaway here is that part of the reason there's no golden pill to make this all go away is that the same benefits that companies are gaining from this and be able to use this are being transferred to the criminal element, and that's hard to stop as a result of that. So.
Anybody else want to throw something out before we put it out to the audience?
I mean, we try and focus on practical solutions and raising awareness that these this is an issue, and it behooves the consumer to protect to the extent that they can their own PII. I mean, one feature that we rolled out in our products a couple of years ago is the ability to lock and unlock your credit report, and now you can do it on your mobile device. Being in the business, I thought this feature would just take off and, I'd get 100% adoption on it. It's free in your subscription, but we've had, less than 25% of folks actually activate that service despite our repeated entreaties to do so. So, we've got to continue to stay at it. I mean, that's a practical thing that you can do that would dramatically, I think, reduce the risk that you would have that your data would be used to, open new accounts or commit financial fraud. So, the more we can do to raise awareness that it behooves consumers to take an interest in this and protect themselves to the extent that they can.
Was that a free service?
That's not a free service. There is a free service, a free version of it, and it's dictated by states, et cetera. Have different requirements around a credit freeze, but we turned it into a feature of our subscription product, so it's part of their paid subscription.
So let's throw it out to the audience. Anybody? I'm sure there's some questions. Over here. Oh, Michael. Nice to see you.
I'll tell Mom you're okay.
Okay, thanks.
One of the questions I got, and Michael brought it up, is these are all subscription services. I have to continue to opt out of things. Why isn't it that I have to opt in? Because if you go to any of the things, even Verizon, yesterday, they'll give my information to their partners unless I read through 33 pages and go to the block that says, no, don't do that. For TransUnion, I have to subscribe to your service so that you don't do anything with my information. So why can't you make it so that I have to opt in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you think about how the credit bureaus started and what their purpose was, it was really business-driven and still is for most of us. Our business, the business-to-business sides of our business are much bigger than our consumer businesses. So I think a lot of it is, just historical, that people wanted quick access to evaluate a consumer, and that's how these businesses evolved. It's only in the last 10 or 15 years that it's gone down the road of empowering consumers to manage their data. I think personally that we will eventually get to the point where consumers are controlling their data and who it goes to. But I think we're evolving toward that slowly, but I think we'll eventually get there.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, the idea of how the consumer is able to control the data that's about them, that you and others are custodians of. I mean, do you see regulation coming that is going to give consumers greater control, like that would impact your business?
I don't. I think the market is driving a lot of this. So, for example, now you can go to sites like Credit Karma and get free credit score, free credit monitoring. You can look at your TransUnion file, and they advertise financial services products to you. I think that the banks who used to sell these services as well, but were doing so in a way that the regulators didn't like. They were fined. Now they've been on the sideline for a couple of years. I think that you will see in the coming years banks providing free identity protection services to consumers. So the market seems to be going that way. There'll always be, people will always try and make money from it in terms of selling like a more robust version of the product. But we've seen tens of millions of consumers in the last few years access this credit data and be able to manage it for free.
Anybody else? Oh, all the way in the back, on the left.
Hi, this is for Brian, especially given his retail perspective. You talked early on about managing and navigating versus solving against threats and ID fraud-related threats. Can you expand on that, especially given your retail perspective?
You know, I guess the statement is that this isn't sort of a binary thing. It's, we're not going to ever be at one place holistically on a continuum, and it's kind of like the Monopoly game that never ends. There's not going to be a win or a lose. It's the conditions. It's the conditions of our environment. Edward, I think, summed it up really well, is to say that within this economic function, there's going to be the good and the bad. And what we're trying to do is minimize the losses that happen inside of the bad to the degree that we're able to tolerate them. And I think the thing that we're sort of feeling anxiety around is that so much of it is so new that right when we think we can tolerate something, it changes. And then we learn what our new tolerance is. And that, we sit here and think we've got to get much further along on the continuum towards solution. And then we see consumer behaviors and how they elect certain things that tell us perhaps that we don't need to be as far along. And I think we're just kind of feeling our way through where we sit on that continuum and balance. And again, trying to manage it to the degree that, there's the business to business side of it. There's how that implies itself inside of the consumer market. And, I think we, Susan was mentioning things about how the financial services industry has sort of been inside of this, from at least my perspective, this cyber threat kind of aspect, and retailers are in that place now as well. It's another tool. It's another thing that helps them manage their risks inside of it, and much like they've gotten to tolerable levels of loss in other types of shrink or physical. They're feeling their way through what those tolerable levels of losses are in the cyber element and e-fraud and otherwise. And sometimes it's uncomfortable because it's exceeded those tolerances, and they have to have some reactions to sway things the other way. But that's just simply what I meant, was that we're not going to ultimately eliminate fraud. We're not going to eliminate identity theft, but somewhere in here we'll find the comfortable balance, and it'll change tomorrow.
Well, Katie is approaching, so I think we're out of time. So thanks very much to everybody. Thanks for the panelists. And I think, I'm hopeful there is a solution we can all find together at some point as we weave our way through. Thanks.